On my way in, I learned that this is my second visit here. I was here 30 years ago, apparently, but my memory isn't that good. A lot of talk since then. Since Michael mentioned the 14th Amendment, I might add another fact about it that's worth bearing in mind. Now, the 14th Amendment, which essentially repeats the wording of the 5th Amendment and extends it to states, says that no person can be deprived of life or liberty without due process of the law. And as Michael said, it was passed to apply, the intention was to apply it to free slaves. It was virtually never applied to free slaves, almost entirely to corporations. The wording of the Fifth and the 14th Amendment is problematic. It refers to persons, and it was quickly understood that that won't work. The normal meaning of person is somebody like you, but that won't work. It's too narrow and too broad. So the courts over the years have modified it, both narrowed it and extended it. They've extended it in the way that Michael mentioned. About a century ago, the courts determined that corporations, fictitious legal entities established by the state, are persons. And over the years, they've gotten more and more rights. By now, rights way beyond persons of flesh and blood. But it's also too broad because it includes, if you take it literally, it includes people who don't have citizenship. And we certainly can't agree to allow those creatures to have human rights. So the courts over the years have narrowed the notion person, so it doesn't include those human-like creatures who don't happen to have formal citizenship. So it's both extended and broadened, and both in ways which are, I think we should recognize to be deeply anti-human, quite apart from the literal meaning of the word person. Well, the topic that was announced is at a very broad scope. I can't possibly even try to do justice to it. You can bring up many other phenomena, events, and so on that fall within the range of the topic. Later, I'll just talk about a few. I actually want to focus on just two places that are of particular significance right now, and both of which have a lot to do with social justice and people-centered society. One of them is Madison, Wisconsin. The other is Cairo. And different parts of the world, but the same issues are being addressed actually in quite different ways. And the difference between those two ways ought to be of considerable concern to us, I think. I'll go into that. The two cities were brought together just a couple of days ago by Kamal Abbas. He is a leader of the long and hard struggles of Egyptian workers for...
Professor Chomsky, I'm sorry. Could you speak a little louder?
Oh, can't hear me? Were you able to hear me?
That's better. Thank you.
Oh, I'll try to lean forward. Well, I was just saying that I'm going to talk about Cairo and Madison and the ways in which they're both similar and crucially different, and the differences ought to be a matter of concern to us. They were brought together a couple of days ago by Kamal Abbas. He's a leader of the Egyptian workers' movement. Contrary to what you might think, the uprising didn't begin January 25th. It's been going on for years. There's been a long, hard struggle for workers' rights and other rights in Egypt, and repressed by violence. He's also one of the leaders of the January 25th movement, this spectacular movement that developed in the last couple of weeks, which is historically almost unique, maybe unique. He sent a message to Madison, to Wisconsin workers, in which he said, "We stand with you as you stood with us. And he's quite right to appeal to the notion of solidarity. It's the core element of the union movement for 150 years, and it's the traditional driving force. He's also right to compare the Egyptian and the U.S. struggles for not only labor rights, but also for democracy, and to link them together, because they're very closely intertwined and always have been. Everywhere, Egypt, the United States generally, the labor movement has almost always been right at the forefront of struggles to preserve and expand democracy and human rights, not just labor rights, civil rights, almost everything. And that remains true today. Well, right now, the trajectories of the Egyptian and U.S. labor movement are crossing, but they're moving in different directions. In Egypt, they're moving towards gaining rights that have been denied. In the United States, they're focused on defending rights that had been won and are being attacked and lost. So we're crossing, and we're going the wrong way. They're going the right way. It's worth taking a look at each of these cases. So let me say something about each of them, starting with Egypt. The January 25th uprising, as I'm sure you know, was sparked by tech-savvy young people from what's called the April 6th movement. What's not too well known is that the April 6th movement takes its name from a labor struggle in April 6, 2008. That's not the first, but there was a major strike planned in the major textile industry, the Mahala textile industry, one of the biggest industries on April 6th. There were also substantial solidarity actions planned from the community and elsewhere. They had won some local rights in the past, but the April 6th actions were crushed by state power, state violence, nevertheless, Mahala became, in the words of Nada Mata, she's a young woman, Palestinian woman actually, who studies labor rights and the labor movement in Egypt and has worked in Mahala. She says that Mahala then became a symbol of revolt and challenge to the regime in a number of ways. The early labor struggles had a kind of narrow focus, wages, working conditions, and so on. But by the time of the April 6th events that were crushed by the state, by Mubarak, they had expanded to minimum wage for all Egyptians and to the formation of an independent union. It's barred by the Mubarak regime. They still haven't gained an independent union. And Mubarak, like the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, or the Koch brothers who fund him, and the business world generally, they understand that this is a real danger. If the labor movement goes beyond saying, I'd like 5 cents more an hour, and is talking about the rights of the population in general, and the right to act independently, to associate independently and organize, then the consequences for expanding democracy are quite real, and power systems in general, state or private, do not want democracy expanded for pretty good reasons. It tends to threaten privilege. And that's, in fact, what we're seeing right now. Actually, that's is a very important part of American labor history. Take a look, say, at the United States and Canada, two very similar societies. The United States has a completely dysfunctional healthcare system, international scandal. It's about twice the per capita costs of every other of comparable countries, the outcomes are among the poorest. It's the main source of the famous deficit that we're supposed to worry about. If we had a health system like other comparable countries, we'd actually have a budget surplus at this point. The other half of the deficit is military spending, which is about as much as the rest of the world combined. And if you look at the discussion about the deficit, which is flaming all over the place, there are two things that aren't mentioned, namely its causes. The causes are, first, military spending, and secondly, the dysfunctional healthcare system. And it's not utopian to imagine that we could have a healthcare system like other societies that are similar to us. And one of them is Canada. Back around the 1950s, the unions in the United States and Canada went in different directions with regard to health care. The American unions, which had been already somewhat tamed, didn't take the concept solidarity very seriously. They got health care for themselves. So the UAW, United Auto Workers, were able to get pretty good health packages for themselves in a bargain with corporations. And they were naive enough to think that the management of the corporations would keep the bargain. I'll come to that later. They didn't. In Canada, it was different. The same unions, very same unions, wanted to get health care for everyone. And in fact, they won. So Canada has a functioning health care system for everyone. The United States does not. We have a virtually unregulated, privatized system, which is hopelessly inefficient, bureaucratized, huge administrative costs, profit, essentially leading to the consequence that we have today. Twice per capita expenses and poor outcomes. Well, that's one of the meanings of solidarity. That's one of the reasons why Mubarak, Scott Walker and his backers and others are have been trying very hard to prevent unions from being formed unless they can be properly tamed, just disciplining the workforce and not doing anything else. And that's not easy to sustain, so unions are a constant enemy. Not just of Mubarak. You might recall that on his way to Egypt, to Cairo, 2009, to give his famous speech addressing the Muslim world, President Obama, a lot of fanfare about that. There was less reporting of the press conference that he had on the way to Egypt. He was asked at the press conference whether he would say anything about what the report called the authoritarian regime in Egypt. That's pretty much an understatement. It's one of the worst, most brutal dictatorships in the Arab world, and there's plenty of competition. And Obama said that he would not talk about that. He said, I don't like to use labels for folks. When a political leader uses the word folks, you wait for the lie that's coming along. Otherwise, you talk about people, but when you're talking about folks, something's being set up. So he didn't like to use labels for folks. He said, Mubarak's a good man. He's doing good things for Egypt. He's keeping it stable. He's a good ally, so I'm not going to criticize him. And that was not very long ago, 2009. And it's consistent with traditional support for dictatorships, not just only on the part of the United States, but other powerful states as well, their allies. Well, that's what Nada Mata said about the Mahala strike and the April 6th workers' movement is supported, corroborated by Joel Bainan. He's the leading U.S. academic specialist on Egyptian labor, teaches at Stanford. He points out that after many years of struggle, workers in Egypt had come to know and trust each other, formed bonds of solidarity, and were able to mobilize rapidly. And in fact, that's what happened after January 25th. A couple of days later, they mobilized rapidly. They joined the January 25th movement, these amazing events in Tahrir Square and other cities in Egypt. And at that point, the die was basically cast. The military high command shifted its position, told Mubarak, the dictator, that the time has come to disappear, go off to Saudi Arabia, enjoy yourself for the rest of your life. And that was, and Obama went along with that, and that was really a major victory for the democracy movement, an extremely courageous and quite remarkable movement. Hard to think of counterparts. They won a big victory, but there are plenty of barriers that remain, internal ones and external ones. As far as the internal ones are concerned, if you look at Egypt, and the same is true of Tunisia and other places, the military is still in command. It, in fact, has been running the country since 1952, now in a different form. And they're not going to give up. Actually, there's splits in the military. It wouldn't be too surprising to see an officers' coup overthrowing the high command. That's what happened in 1954 in Egypt. The high command is pretty much disliked by the officer corps. They're militarily totally incompetent. They're not military leaders. And they're businessmen, corrupt businessmen who own a large part of the economy, deeply involved with the business elite that's been robbing the country blind, particularly during the neoliberal period, the last 30 years or so. And they're not, the high command's not going to give up its holdings easily, nor will the rest of the business elite. And those are significant internal problems. And they're helped by external problems. The U.S. position on Egypt in the last couple of weeks is extremely familiar. I mean, there's case after case where it's, over the past years, where it's become impossible, for one or another reason, to maintain a favored dictator in power. And maybe the army turns against him, or business classes turn against him, or there's just too much people's power in the streets, and you've got to do something. And there's a standard procedure in that case. You support the dictator up to the last minute, as long as possible. When it becomes impossible, send them out to pasture, issue ringing declarations about how we've always been on the side of the people and democracy, and we love freedom, and so on. And then, meanwhile, try to restore as much of the existing system as possible, maybe with a couple of new names. That's happened over and over. Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Chun in South Korea during the Reagan years, Suharto in Indonesia under Clinton, just case after case. And what's being played out now, as far as Washington planning is concerned, is pretty much the same. And it's not just Washington, remember. Washington, the United States happens to be the biggest player. We're, the superpower. But U.S. allies behave exactly the same way. So in Northwest Africa, it's France that's the main agent supporting the dictators. And in fact, if you look at the current wave of uprisings throughout the Arab world, the one that made the headlines was Tunisia. It was surprising throughout the dictator, Western-backed dictator. There, France was the primary outside agent involved in maintaining and supporting the dictatorship, and had to go through this routine. But it actually started a couple of weeks earlier in Western Sahara. Western Sahara isn't talked about much, but it was a Spanish colony. It was due for decolonization under UN auspices, and this was supposed to happen in the 1970s, the big period of decolonization. But Morocco invaded It crushed the Sahrawis, Western Sahara independence movement. Pretty brutal invasion. It's been brutal repression and occupation since, but the independence movement still survives. Last November, there was a peaceful and nonviolent movement to try to call once again for the independence that technically has been guaranteed by the United Nations, a tent city set up and so on. The Moroccan army swept in, crushed it, killed people and so on. It was brutal enough so that it made it to the United Nations. And there was an effort to try to at least have a UN inquiry into what happened. But that was crushed by France. France blocked it. We're usually the one who blocks actions at the Security Council. This time was France, supporting Morocco, their favorite dictatorship in these former French colonized regions. But mainly we're the ones who are carrying out these actions with their allies and support. Well, in this case, there is an this is a major external force. The United States and its allies are going to do just about anything they can to prevent democracy from spreading in the Arab world, at least if it's anything more than just formal democracy, like maybe we permit in Central America or something. Just real democracy in which the popular opinion will have a significant effect on policy. That can't be tolerated. And there's a very good reason. To find out why, all you have to do is look at the studies of public opinion in the Arab world. Now, they exist. They don't get reported, but they exist. They're taken by major Western polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions. The major one was released by the Brookings Institution last August. Not reported, but surely known to intelligence agencies, planners, and so on. What they explain very clearly why democracy is intolerable in the Middle East. In fact, here too, but for similar reasons. But in the Middle East, it would be a catastrophe. It turns out that about, by overwhelming majorities, 80, 90%, the population in the Arab world regards the major threat as the United States and Israel. When WikiLeaks came out, you may remember there was a lot of euphoria, big headlines, claiming that the Arab states support us. The Arabs support us in our attitude towards Iran. You take a close look. What it meant is that the Arab dictators allegedly support us, not the population. Among the population, there are some who regard Iran as a threat, about 10%. Nothing like the United States and Israel, 80, 90%. But that's just the people, and who cares about them? As long as the dictators support us, we're fine. That reveals the general attitude towards democracy, not just in the government and the diplomatic service, but in the general intellectual culture. That's why you had the headlines and the euphoria. If the population hate us, it makes no difference as long as the dictators support us. And that goes way back. The fear and contempt for democracy in elite, educated, cultured circles, environment in which we live is very profound and understandable when you think about what the consequences of democracy would be. In fact, opposition to U.S. policies in the Arab world is so strong that a majority of the population thinks the region would be better off, more secure, if Iran had nuclear weapons to counter the power of the two major threats, the United States and Israel, which are pretty much the same, which was pretty much an offshoot of U.S. power. Well, that's the population. If you look at Egypt, the figure is even more extreme. More opposition to U.S. policy, more support for Iranian nuclear weapons, and so on. Well, just a look at those numbers tells you immediately why the United States and its allies are going to pull out all the stops to prevent any democracy development and progress in democracy in the Middle East region. It would mean unraveling the entire imperial system of control, which goes way back and is crucial to controlling the world back right after the Second World War. Liberal planners in the Roosevelt-Truman administration recognized that if we can control the Middle East, we can, with its energy reserves, we can control the world. And if we lose control of these energy resources, we're in trouble. We're not going to be able to manage to dominate the world system. And that remains true. It's not a matter of access. If the United States was 100% on solar energy, it would still be true, because that's the way you control other countries. So this is no small thing. Whatever. There is, of course, plenty of talk about our yearning for democracy, our love of democracy, and so on. And maybe the people who say the words actually believe it, who knows. But in fact, it's just for propaganda and ideology. There's a long record about this, not just in the Middle East, and it's been well established, even by conservative scholarship is forced to concede it, that the United States supports democracy just insofar as it contributes to strategic and economic objectives. So right now, for example, we're calling for democracy in Iran, but we're going to do anything possible to block it in areas that we control. And that is systematic. It goes over every administration, goes far back, and is shared by allies. So that's the true meaning of democracy promotion. Actually, in the case of Egypt, there's an earlier history which may sound exotic now, but and it's almost never talked about, but it's quite real. If you go back to the early American Industrial Revolution, early part of the 19th century, Egypt was at that time in a pretty good position, pretty well placed to carry out an industrial revolution of its own. Egypt had a rich agriculture. In fact, that's why it was conquered by Napoleon. It had cotton. Cotton was the kind of like oil, and today cotton was the fuel of the early industrial revolution, which sort of took off with textiles and so on. Egypt had its own cotton, quite a lot of it. It didn't need slaves to, it didn't have to bring in slaves to cultivate the cotton the way we did. It, had what amounted to serfs, but peasants on the land who would do it. It had a nationalist leader, Muhammad Ali, who was committed to trying to carry out an industrial revolution. There was one difference, fundamental difference between the United States and Egypt. The United States had won its independence. Egypt hadn't. Egypt was still under British control. The U.S. wasn't. And that made all the difference. The United States was therefore able to disregard the precepts for development that are handed down by the powerful. They're usually transmitted by economists. And they were the same then as they are now. Back then it was Adam Smith who gave his instructions to the colonies. He was in favor of, wasn't opposed to their liberation, but he said that they have to be economically rational. The American colonies, once liberated, had to follow what are nowadays called neoliberal principles. Pursue your comparative advantage, ship agricultural products, fish and fur. Don't you import higher British industrial goods, which were much higher quality, and don't have any tariffs or anything to try to prevent, to try to produce your own industrial goods. And crucially, don't try to gain a monopoly over the commodities that you have in abundance, like cotton, which is the main one. So don't try to have a monopoly of cotton. And economic theory proves that it's much better for everyone if you follow these precepts. Well, the United States was independent, so therefore it could throw the economists out the window and do exactly the opposite of what they, Adam Smith and others, prescribed, and in fact follow the path that England itself had followed for its own development. state, and every other developed country has followed, namely reject all of these principles. There's no exception from England, and starting in the 16th century up to the Asian tigers in China today, certainly the United States. So the U.S. established, set up very high tariffs to block superior British goods. That continued as textiles, later steel, and so on. There was a state-directed economic development policy. It was pretty extreme. It's not even talked about by economic historians. But conquering the national territory and exterminating the indigenous population and slavery, there are pretty significant interferences with the market. Not discussed much, but for ideological reasons. And as far as the cotton was concerned, the U.S. worked very hard to obtain a near monopoly. That's the reason for the conquest of Texas and of half of Mexico, which we're sitting on. It was explicitly to try to gain as much as close as it could, a monopoly of cotton. And the purpose was to bring England to its feet. Remember, Britain was a big enemy then. They were the powerful state. They were barring U.S. expansion and so on. But the Jacksonian Democratic presidents, Taylor, Polk, and so on, they recognized that if we could gain a monopoly of cotton, we could bring Britain to its feet. It would rely on us. So it did exactly the opposite of what was proposed, and it worked. The United States had a big industrial revolution. Egypt couldn't do that. The British power quite explicitly said, we're not going to allow it. Lord Palmerston and others said, Britain will not permit any competition in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were powerful enough to repress it. This is not the only case, but it's one of the many cases where gaining independence enabled countries to pursue economic policies that are declared to be irrational and that succeed, instead of keeping to those that are declared to be rational and lead you to become the third world. The evidence for this is just overwhelming. A few exceptions, slight exceptions here and there, but it's overwhelming. And the same is true today. The same precepts are given now by the World Bank and the IMF and the economics profession, not by Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others, but pretty much the same. And I'm not suggesting any bad faith. In an abstract sense, some abstract world that doesn't exist, these precepts could in fact work, but not in the real world. In the real world, the opposite is what works. When the U.S., after the Second World War, the United States essentially displaced Britain as the dominant world power, including in the Middle East. And the U.S. orders to Egypt right after the Second World War were essentially the same as Lord Palmerston. You have to follow neoliberal, what are now called neoliberal principles. The U.S. simply declared that it would withhold any aid or support unless Egypt kept to those standard rules. The U.S. of course, doesn't keep to the rules themselves, nor did Britain. So the U.S. imposed high tariffs, contrary to the rules, in order to keep Egyptian cotton out. That's in order to maintain the wealth and power and near monopoly of American cotton growers. That still goes on until this moment. We still have huge subsidies and tariffs to subsidize the cotton industry and others. That's the usual double-edged economic policy, kind of like democracy. We follow free trade principles if and only if it's supportive of the power interests of dominant sectors here. Well, in any event, as far as Egypt, so Egypt stayed a third world country. It's conceivable. By now it's hard to imagine, but after almost 200 years, but 180 years, but it's conceivable that Egypt might move on a course of independent development. South Korea did it not very long ago from an even poorer position. Anyhow, there is an earlier history, and it has its consequences. For example, right up till this moment, you recall, I'm sure, that after 9/11, George Bush made a speech in which he explained why they hate us. They hate our freedom. Right after that, the Pentagon a Pentagon study group, the Defense Science Board, looked into why they hate us and drew the conclusions that any rational person who knows anything about the history of the region would conclude. They said they don't hate our freedoms, they hate our policies. And they particularly hate our policies of supporting dictatorships, blocking democracy and development, and doing it because we want to control their resources. That's what they hate. They were not saying anything novel. Back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was concerned about what he called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not among the rulers. They were mostly okay, kind of like the WikiLeaks revelations, but among the people. And the National Security Council, the highest planning body, in fact issued a study, secret then, declassified some years ago, in which they said, yes, there's a campaign of hatred against us because there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictators, blocks democracy and development, and we do it because we want to control their energy supplies. And it went on to say that the perception is pretty accurate, and that's what we should be doing, as long as the dictators stay in control. And that runs right up to the moment. That's the reason for those the general reactions to the revelations on alleged Arab support for U.S. policy towards Iran. Dictators have everything under control. Don't worry about it. That's fine. That's our conception of democracy. And that's what's being challenged. And it's a serious problem. You're not going to read about it in commentary, but you can be sure that those are the problems that planners in the United States and its allies are really concerned about. Well, let's turn to the United States, Wisconsin and other places. Going back a little bit, after World War II, by World War II, the United States was in a position of just overwhelming power. It had about half the world's wealth. Other industrial countries had been destroyed or severely weakened, incomparable security. The Second World War got the United States out of the Depression, a huge state spending, huge deficit, but nobody cared because you could pay it off with economic growth. And in fact, the next couple of decades, again, with plenty of state involvement. That's why you have computers and the internet and flying airplanes and so on. Most of it comes from state-subsidized or state-initiated development. There was a period of tremendous economic progress. In fact, it's called, by economists, golden age of capitalism, the 50s and 60s. A very high growth, unprecedented growth, and quite egalitarian growth. So the bottom sector of the income distribution did about as well as the higher sectors. Furthermore, there was progressive legislation. A lot of things, the New Deal legislation was already there, it was preserved. People like Eisenhower, for example, if he were alive now, he'd be a liberal Democrat. He's way to the left of the Republican Party. His position was that the New Deal legislation is firm, cannot be touched, has to be honored, extended. That continued. In fact, it continued right through the Nixon administration. And Nixon was the last liberal president and initiated quite a number of serious progressive measures. Well, all of this appalled the business community, as you can imagine. There was an immediate attack on the labor movement starting shortly after the Second World War, but it really escalated in the mid-'70s, late '70s. It was a backlash to two major events. First of all, the activism of the '60s, which terrified elites. It was leading to a democratization of the society. In fact, it was called that, too much democracy. You've got to beat it back. Those of you who are students will be interested in, or maybe collapsing under tuition debts, should recognize that this started in the '70s, and it started as an indoctrination technique, a disciplinary technique. You come out of college with $50,000 debt, you're trapped. And it was conscious, There's no economic reason for it, done in countries that are much poorer than the United. For example, in Mexico, a poor country, there's quite a good national university. I just gave some talks there a couple of months ago. Very high level, it's free. Here, the public education system is being systematically destroyed in more than half the states. There's more public higher education is being funded more by tuition than by the states. That's hitting the state colleges here too, probably Bridgewater. I don't know. I know it's hitting other ones, and of course the state universities too. In California, the greatest public education system in the world is being carefully and systematically destroyed by essentially privatizing the major universities and reducing the others to vocational schools with the support coming from students and their parents, high tuition and so on. Well, all of this starts in the 70s, and it was part of a concern over what was called, incidentally called at the liberal end of the spectrum. The right end was much worse. At the liberal end of the spectrum, it was called the failure of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That means the schools, the universities, the churches, and so on. They're not carrying out their task of indoctrinating the young properly. And something has to be done about that. Educational curricula have been changed, high tuition as a disciplinary technique, and other measures. That's what you're living with. And the backlash went way beyond that. There was deep concern about the class treachery of the Nixon administration, namely his carrying forward the essentially progressive policies of the New Deal, Great Society, and so on. Now that led to real changes. For one thing, there was a huge increase in lobbying in the early 70s, try to make sure corporations control the legislative agenda. There were new think tanks, American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, and so on, to try to control the ideological spectrum. There was a sharp change in the nature of the economy. Starting from the mid-70s, the economy shifted dramatically from production to finance. At that stage, mid-70s, financial institutions were a small percentage of corporate profit, and there were no financial crises because the New Deal regulatory arrangements were sustained, so no financial crises. And the financial institutions did what they're supposed to do. Take unused funds and convert them to productive enterprises. But starting in the 70s, that changed radically. And now the financial institutions are mostly there for speculation, games with money, and so on. They contribute almost nothing to the economy. They may probably harm it. But their growth of their increase in power was spectacular. By the peak, right before the latest crash, they probably had about 40% of corporate profits, if not more, up from a few percentage in the 70s. At the same time, there was a hollowing out of production. And not that it stopped, it was just being done abroad. So for, say, Dell or General Electric or whoever, it's much cheaper to produce in Mexico or China or Vietnam than to produce in the United States. So for the management and the owners, it's the banks, it's great, not so great for American workers, for what we call the middle class. You're not allowed to talk about working class here, so everybody's middle class. But people who in other countries are called working class, less indoctrinated countries. Inequality began to rise very sharply. As you all know, inequality is extreme in the United States now. It's back to the worst moments of American history. And what's a little less known is that that inequality is mostly traceable to the top 1% of the population, or for that matter, even the top 1/10 of 1%. In that tiny sliver of the society, wealth has increased enormously, skyrocketed since the 1970s. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened by what amounts to a kind of a vicious cycle. As income gets more concentrated, partly through the financial institutions, that yields political power, which lies in the hands of wealth. And the political power, in turn, leads to legislation, which increases inequality. And that vicious cycle has gone on and led to a society in which, it was totally out of balance. Enormous wealth in the very top end, and pretty much stagnation for the majority of the population for over 30 years now. Began in the late 70s, really took off under Reagan and his successors. And it's very carefully done. So if you take a look at, say, the Bush tax cuts, which are devastating. Reagan himself practically destroyed the economy. When he came in, the U.S. was the world's largest creditor. When he left, it was the world's largest debtor, tripled U.S. debt. Talk about financial conservatism is hogwash. This is most everything else. But and this was then continued, especially by W. Bush, latest Bush. The Bush tax cuts, which are now a very serious burden on the economy, were designed very carefully. At the beginning of the tax cuts, 2001, it began with everyone getting a small check. That was to make everybody feel, this is good for us. Let's support the tax cut. So you got a couple $100 in the mail. But they were designed so that the proportion of the tax cut that benefits the extreme wealth is delayed, keeps coming in later on when nobody's paying attention. And by the end, it was a 10-year program. By the 10th year, I think over half of the tax cuts were going to the top 1% of the population, but you don't notice it then. That's the idea. And fiscal policies, corporate governance policies, deregulation, a whole range of government policies were set up to make this vicious cycle continue. And it has. There were repeated financial crises. Once you start deregulating, for almost obvious reasons, the financial institutions are going to have crises. And they did. There were several during the Reagan years. Reagan left office with a major one, the worst since the Depression, the savings and loan. Clinton left office with a tech bubble crisis. And of course, we had the housing bubble crisis of the last couple of years, which completely tanked the economy and has led to depression-level standards for a good part of the population, lower income half. For manufacturing workers, it's very, unemployment's about at depression levels, and worse in some ways because those jobs aren't coming back under the current financialization, offshoring regime. They were in the Depression. The population has been getting by sharply increasing working hours, now well above Europe, and by debt. People went deeply into debt, and by asset inflation, like putting your money into your house with promises that prices are going to go up forever. Well, there was an $8 trillion disappearance of wealth starting in 2008, and that's a lot. People, that's where people's wealth was. Well, that's what's been going on for the past roughly 30-odd years, and it's been combined with, incidentally, it's not a secret. So, for example, in 1978, the head of the United Auto Workers Union, Doug Fraser, condemned the business leaders, I'll quote him, for having chosen to wage a one-sided class war in this country, a war against working people, the unemployed, the poor, the minorities, the very young, the very old, and even many in the middle class of our society, and having broken and discarded the fragile, unwritten compact previously existing during a period of growth and progress. Yeah, it was an unwritten compact. That was that compact between unions and corporations, which the unions took seriously. Naively, corporations didn't. They were continuing to fight a bitter class war, and when it just became too costly, they want to destroy it. That's what's happening in Madison. Well, that's this. At the same time, over the past 30 years, in parallel to what I described, the costs of campaigning have shot way up. If you want to, in fact, the business press announced a couple of days ago that the estimated cost for the 2012 presidential campaign is going to be $2 billion or more. And that's been going up steadily, and it has an effect. It means that the political parties, candidates, if they want to stay in the game, are going to have to cater to those with super wealth. That means the CEOs, the hedge fund managers, and so on, those who are way at the top rank of the economic ladder. And that's what they've been doing. For the Republicans, it comes naturally. It's not an effort. They're mostly there already. The Democrats today are mostly what we used to be called moderate Republicans. They've moved well to the right, and partly for the same reasons, partly because they want to do it anyhow, but partly because if you want to be in the game, that's what you do. Like Obama in the 2008 election, the main reason he won is he was favored by the financial institutions. They poured money into his campaign. They figured he'd do better for them than McCain, and of course they expected to be rewarded, and they were. They're the ones who were basically rewarded by government policies under Obama. They caused the recession, but they're richer and bigger and better than before. They have a pretty good game running for them. With the financialization of the economy and the deregulation, you can predict that there are going to be financial crises. For good, no, pretty obvious, but it's predictable. And they keep coming. They didn't come at all during the regulatory period. But they're not a problem. So if you're a Goldman Sachs executive or JP Morgan Chase or Citigroup or whatever, you can make very risky transactions, which means you get a lot of profit. And then when it all collapses, as it will, you have a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail. So the government insurance policy, which allows you to carry out these transactions, also guarantees that you don't suffer for it, because the taxpayer is brought in after it crashes to bail you out, which is exactly what happens. So, for example, right at this moment, like the last couple of weeks, during all the talk about how we all have to share austerity, this and that, Goldman Sachs is one of the biggest gangsters, announced that in the business press, like not in the headlines of your local paper, announced that they're going to they just announced $17.5 billion in compensation for their executives last year. And the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, he gets $12.6 million as a bonus, and his base salary is more than tripled. Given the way the laws of corporate governance have been established by the federal government, that means he's giving that money to himself, because the CEOs are allowed to pick the boards that decide on their compensation. Well, yeah, that's the way the vicious cycle operates. Meanwhile, the business is very highly class conscious. They bitterly opposed to unions for a number of reasons. For one thing, because unions defend workers' rights, and that includes not just wages. It could include, and some countries does, a right for some degree of participation in management. And the business classes who can think a little bit ahead recognize that that could mean worker takeover of the industries. Why do you need managers? We can run them better ourselves. Something kind of like that just happened in Taunton, a few miles away from here, where the multinational, I'm sure you know, wanted to close down a pretty successful production unit. It wasn't making enough profit for them. The union workers offered to buy it, but the multinational preferred to lose money and to give it up rather than to allow a successful worker-managed enterprise to be established, as might have happened. They're class conscious. They're deeply committed Marxists. They're fighting a class war all the time. And if they don't have any countervailing force, they, of course, going to win. Well, the unions are the main countervailing force, so really important to get rid of them. Private sector unions have been almost eliminated, down to like 7% of the workforce. It's not because workers don't want to join unions. In fact, polls show a very, am I running out of time?
No, it's first warning.
First warning? Okay. It's good to have somebody keep you honest. Private sector unions are, say, like 7% of the workforce. Polls demonstrate that the large majority of workers want to join unions, but they can't because the laws are set up unlike other countries, so you're pretty much barred from doing it. Also, there are union-busting tactics that have been carefully honed over the years. I'm sure you know this, there are companies that specialize in techniques of strike breaking and breaking organizing efforts. It's mostly illegal, but when you have a criminal state, you can carry out illegal actions. The government just doesn't enforce the laws and says so. So they're pretty successful. Anyhow, you have a huge pool of workers who want to join unions and can. The United States is, again, almost unique in the world in this respect, certainly unique among the industrial societies. What's left is the public sector unions. They've managed to sustain themselves, so you have to go after them. And that's what's been happening dramatically in the last couple of months, and that's what's happening right now in Wisconsin. It's claimed that it's because of the deficit. It has absolutely nothing to do with the deficit. The issue is collective bargaining rights. That doesn't affect the deficit one way or another. That's an effort to destroy unions, and that's why the Koch brothers and others are funding it. Maybe we can get rid of this last shred of countervailing power to corporate tyranny. You get rid of the unions, you're not going to have these barriers to taking over everything. And that's exactly what's happening there. In order to gain some public support, you have to divert. People are angry, and for pretty good reasons. It's been a pretty rotten 30-odd years for most of the population. But you have to divert that anger, not to Goldman Sachs and its huge bonuses. You know, people look at that. Divert it to say teachers and firefighters and police and librarians and the other people who are really responsible for the fiscal crisis with their fat bonuses, these huge pensions, high salaries. It's all total fabrication. But if you don't have any counterforce and you keep repeating it often enough, people come to believe it. And there's some element of the population that believes all that. It's growing, in fact. Polls demonstrate. Teachers are a particular victim, but that's also for another reason, because there's a major effort underway to destroy the public education system. Now, that's true at all levels, from kindergarten up through research universities. At the public level, the goal is to try to privatize it, hand it over to private hands. Then it'll be work for the rich, won't work for anyone else. If you want to privatize a system, there's a standard technique for doing it. Defund it. If you defund some system, say railroads or whatever it is, and therefore it doesn't work properly, and then people get angry because it's not working, you can come along and say, well, the reason it's not working is it's public, so let's hand it over to corporate power, and then everything will be great. Done over and over again. That's exactly what's being done with the public education system. Way defunded, salaries are too low, class sizes are growing, infrastructure is collapsing, and so on, so people don't like it. And then you have a way to enter this entering wedge for privatization techniques, whether you call them charter schools or whatever you call them. But the goal's the same. Just get rid of this thorn in our sides, public education. Public education is a thorn in the side for several reasons. For one thing, it's of no value whatsoever to the rich. They can send their kids to private schools, and they do anyway. And for another, it has a dangerous ideological effect. Public education is based on the same principle as the labor unions, solidarity. Public education is based on the principle of, say, me. I don't have kids in school, obviously, but public education is based on the idea that I have a responsibility for the kid across the street, that he gets an education. And you got to knock that out of people's heads. The idea that you care about each other and you have sympathy and solidarity, really dangerous idea. You're supposed to be out for yourself. Don't care about anyone else. You kick other people in the face if they're in the way. You do what you want. That's great for the wealthy and the privileged. And there's a huge effort to impose that doctrine. Incidentally, it's the same reason why there's an attack on Social Security. You read take anything you like that say about the deficit. First of all, there is a question whether we should even care about the deficit. Probably we shouldn't. Deficit's a good idea in a recession, but put that aside. Everything you read is we got to do something about the deficit. So New York Times editorial, Rush Limbaugh, whoever it is, it's always the same. In order to deal with the deficit, we've got to face the problem of entitlements, and not the Pentagon, which is half the deficit, and not the healthcare system, which is the other half, but entitlements. And what does entitlements mean? It's listed. Social Security is always listed first, and Medicare and Medicaid. The Social Security contributes 0 to the deficit, not a penny. And those who make these statements know it perfectly well. Social Security payments come out of payroll taxes, separated into a separate trust fund which can't be touched and takes care of the Social Security. Furthermore, it's pretty well funded for decades ahead and can be tweaked to go on indefinitely. But you have to kill Social Security. Again, it's of no value to the rich. Like I get Social Security, but barely notice it. I'm high enough on the income level, so it doesn't matter much. And if you're a billionaire, you can't notice it at all. And it is based on this conception of solidarity. It's based on the idea that you care whether some disabled widow across town has food to eat. And that's a very bad idea. It has to be knocked out of your head, just like the solidarity of the union movement. Another element of Social Security is there's a huge amount of money stored up in the trust funds. And the financial institutions would love to get their hands on it. So then they could make risky investments, make a ton of profit. When it crashes, rely on the government insurance policy, and everything's great. So you have to tax Social Security. Yeah. But what about Medicare and Medicaid? Well, they are a problem. Costs are going way up. But it's not Medicare and Medicaid. They are very efficient. So Medicare administrative costs are a tiny fraction of insurance company administrative costs. Prices are going up because they have to rely on the privatized insurance policy and on the big pharmaceutical corporations, which are, again, untouched by government threats of negotiation, unlike other countries. Well, that's what we're seeing in front of our eyes. And it has a certain effect. Like Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, he's not going to get majority support. In fact, a large majority are in favor of collective bargaining, but there'll be a sufficient minority, so he may be able to ram through the attack on unions. The Obama administration's actually helping. Won't go into that since it's late. But just to end, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the fate of democracy and basic human rights is at stake in Cairo and in Wisconsin, where the directors are moving in opposite directions.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky. Are democracy and capitalism incompatible systems?
Are they incompatible? Yeah, they're incompatible. In fundamental ways, incompatible. I mean, the incompatibility can be reduced. So for example, a regulatory system, public funding of elections. There are a lot of, say, labor rights legislation. There are a lot of ways. Or take say Nixon, the last liberal president, as I mentioned. He introduced measures which infuriated the business world, and in fact, partly responsible for this huge backlash. But they did help the public. Like OSHA, for example, safety and health legislation, or the EPA, which the right-wing Republicans right now are trying to destroy, or the Earned Income Tax Credit, which did help poor people. Well, these are ways of softening the incompatibility, welfare state measures, so-called. But at a deep sense, they really aren't compatible. I mean, they can't be. Capitalism is based on private ownership, private management, and what in the 19th century Americans called wage slavery. I mean, it's kind of interesting to go back and look at the debates about the Civil War, slavery. They're pretty interesting. Southern slave owners had an argument which nobody ever responded to because they couldn't. They argued that they're more humane than Northern capitalists because they own their workers. And if you own something, you take care of it. Like if you own a car, you take care of it. Northern capitalists rented their workers. Like if you rent a car, you don't take care of it. So they're more humane. They had a capital investment in their workforce. And Northern workers accepted that. Around the time of the Civil War, it was pretty well taken for granted among a large part of the population that wage labor is the same as slavery, with the difference that it's temporary. That's Abraham Lincoln. That was actually a slogan of the Republican Party at the time of the Civil War. And it's real. It's taken a lot of effort to knock that idea out of people's heads. And I don't think it's knocked out very far. You could see that in Taunton recently. You know, it was right there waiting to be realized. Okay, we'll take over the factory and run it ourselves.
Professor Chomsky, you had mentioned something before.
Who's talking?
You had mentioned something before, just to follow up that question. One of your lectures about the real Adam Smith. About? The real Adam Smith.
The real Adam Smith.
Yeah, because you know you said capitalism and democracy. You're talking about the real Adam Smith and the real idea of a free society. Just
the real Adam Smith is very different from the caricature you learn about in school. I mean, I quoted a case where Adam Smith was presenting the standard precepts then and now, but there's a lot more. So, for example, Adam Smith had a pretty jaundiced view of. He's kind of pre-capitalist in the modern sense. He's a figure of the Enlightenment. You know, modern capitalism was just beginning, but he didn't like it. He talked about what he called the vile maxim of the masters: all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. And we got to do something about this. If you've taken a course in college or maybe high school, you've read the first paragraph of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how our wealth comes from the fact that the butcher does his thing and the carpenter does his thing and everything works out fine. So division of labor is wonderful. You go in a couple hundred pages into the book and you find a bitter condemnation of division of labor because he's a figure of the Enlightenment. And he recognized that a human intelligence, in any serious sense, is based on independent, creative activity. And he said division of labor is going to turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can possibly be. And in any civilized society, the government's going to have to step in to prevent it. You didn't read that paragraph when you were in college. And in fact, if you take a look at the University of Chicago scholarly edition of Wealth of Nations that came out on the 200th anniversary, you look at the index under division of labor, that paragraph isn't even listed in the index. You don't want anyone to find that one. And it kind of goes on, like take, say, the phrase invisible hand, which everybody's learned, how wonderful the invisible hand is. Well, actually, the phrase invisible hand appears once in Wealth of Nations, so it's not hard to find. And it turns out to be a critique of what we call neoliberalism. What he was saying was that, he said, suppose that he's interested in England, of course, he wasn't talking about the world. He said, suppose in England, merchants and manufacturers, sort of the core of the economy, decided that they could make more money by investing abroad and purchasing from abroad. Neoliberalism, in other words, globalization. Suppose they decided on that. Well, he said that'd be good for them, but it would be very harmful for England. However, he said, they're going to have a certain loyalty to the home country and a confidence in the home country. So they'll choose to invest at home and import from at home. And as if by an invisible hand, England will be saved from the ravages of what we call neoliberal globalization. Actually, David Ricardo is famous, other major founder of modern economics, said about the same thing. And in fact, all the way through you find things like this. Actually, Adam Smith also recognized very well how government policy is made. So he points out that in England, again, his concern, he said government policy is made by the people who own the economy, by the merchants and manufacturers. And they make sure that their own interests are very well cared for, however grievous the effect on others, including the people of England, but particularly in the colonies, mainly India, where they're subject to what he called the savage injustice of the British and other Europeans. He's a figure of the Enlightenment and not of the modern age. If you say those things now, you're considered a radical left-wing conspiracy theorist. But that's the vicious cycle that I was talking about.
I'd like to ask two things. One is that you haven't said anything about the sit-ins in Kentucky, Wendell Berry, about the sit-ins in Kentucky at the state capitol in Kentucky, and the whole environment. Right now, with Wendell Berry and others there, and that goes to the other sort of leg of the tipping stool, and that is the
there's a lot going on.
And secondly, could I just ask what your take is on? I mean, I work for Obama. I would work for him again because I can't see anybody better to work for Obama. And what exactly is happening to him? To what extent is he completely naive to what he's up against? To what extent is he a hostage in the White House? And can he, if he's reelected, get us out of this to some extent?
I mean, I think we should give him enough credit to suppose that he understands what he's doing. He's an intelligent person, literate, think things through. So you're right about Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio. It's going on all over the place, spreading, just like it did in Egypt. It wasn't just Tahrir Square, it was Alexandria and Suez, Western Egypt, and so on. And here, too, a lot's going on. It's kind of exciting. Well, let's take Obama. Let's take the last couple of months, and we can go back earlier. Obama is very much praised by the Democrats, too, for his achievements during the lame duck session. Bipartisanship, we work together, Republicans, everybody's happy, he shows we can work together. What happened in the lame duck session? Well, there was one major achievement, extending the Bush tax cuts. And there's only one issue there, extending the Bush tax cuts for the very rich. And when I say very rich, I mean very rich. Like, as I said, I'm pretty well off, not complaining about my income, but it wouldn't have affected me. It's for the very rich. Tax cuts for them, that was the issue. Now remember, at the same time, everyone's screaming about the deficit. I mean, wrongly, but they are. What he succeeded in doing was giving away tax cuts for the rich without even an effort to prevent it. And in fact, the population was strongly opposed to that, by about 2 to 1. But there wasn't any effort to try to mobilize the population to prevent this giveaway, which is also expanding the deficit. Well, at the very same time, with all this talk about how we have to cut taxes, Obama instituted a tax increase for federal workers. Now, they didn't call it a tax increase. They called it a freeze. But if you think for 30 seconds, a freeze on public sector workers is exactly the same as raising their taxes. Exactly. Fiscal consequences are identical. So what he did was declare a tax increase on federal workers, and then the State of the Union goes on for 5 years, which means it's a substantial tax increase, because if you freeze wages for 5 years, that means the effect is expanded year by year just because of population growth and inflation. Okay. So a major tax increase for public sector workers. And he got away with that partly just because it wasn't reported that way. You know, people didn't think of it that way. That's exactly what it is. But also because of the success of this propaganda campaign, which has been going on for the last couple of months, really, and is pretty spectacular, to try to blame the fiscal problems on librarians, teachers, and so on, not on Lloyd Blankfein, you know, the CEO of Citigroup, and not them or their cohorts in government, but on teachers and pensions and so on and of course the terrible unions which keep them. So he got away with it. You think he doesn't understand it? I mean, look, you can talk about this to sixth graders. They understand it. So he understands it perfectly well, but those are his commitments. I mean, he was put into office primarily by the financial institutions, and he's not going to break with that. In fact, everything he's doing illustrates it. For example, he recently had to appoint someone to be in charge of job promotion. Actually, the English language, the American version of the English language, has a dirty word which you can't pronounce, so I'll have to spell it. There's a 7-letter dirty word, P-R-O-F-I-T-S. There's a way to pronounce that. It's pronounced jobs. So if a politician is committed to increasing profits for the wealthy, he's in favor of job promotion. It's like universal. So Obama had to pick somebody in charge of job promotion. Who did he pick? Jerry Immelt, the CEO of General Electric. The General Electric by now, and there was a big talk about how they produce things here and so on. Actually, most General Electric production's abroad. They ship jobs abroad. And it's about half a financial institution, not even production. But if you want to get your hand deep into corporate pockets for the next election, that's what you do. You pick the CEO of General Electric. And if you know, you can read the business press, and you knew it anyway, that the next election is going to cost billions of dollars, well, that's where you go. I don't see anything naive about this. In fact, it's pretty reasonable, I think. I mean, maybe terrible for the country, but you know, that's not the goal of an elected official.
Hi. Originally, I meant to ask you about something about English, but what do you think would have happened had the bailout not occurred?
If the bailout hadn't occurred?
Yeah. What is your take on that? And if also, obviously, if they're too big to fail, then they would not have failed.
Pardon?
If they were too big to fail, then they would not have failed.
Yeah. So suppose that there had been no bailout. It's a good question. We actually don't know. One thing that would have happened was that the people who owned, say, you know, the shareholders in, say, AIG, the big insurance company, would have taken what's called a haircut in the economic literature. They would have lost money. The owners, the managers, the big the shareholders, yeah, they would have lost money. And in fact, these institutions, some of them would have just gone out of business, the way Lehman Brothers did. What happened was that they were reconstituted on taxpayer funds and are richer and more powerful and bigger than they were before. Well, you know, there are choices in between those two extremes. So it would have been possible to, you know, patch up the crisis that they caused without these kinds of consequences. And furthermore, the government could have just nationalized them. It would have cost less, way less, to take over Citigroup than to bail it out. And if you took it over, you know, in a democratic society, it could be returned to being a financial institution that serves a purpose. I mean, in a capitalist society, you're going to have financial institutions. Like you're going to have a bank which somebody can borrow money from because, you know, they want to buy a house or invest in a company or whatever. That's what financial institutions are supposed to do. They're supposed, in principle, you take an economics course, that's what they do. They take unused funds, like money that, say, you put in your bank account, and they try to divert them to productive activities, like sending your kid to college or starting a business or whatever it may be. Okay, we're not talking at the moment about a different society, just this society. Well, okay, Citigroup could have been turned into a financial institution. I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at the professional economics literature today. Really, for the first time, seriously, there's a beginning of raising, this is by Nobel laureates and others, raising the question, what are these things for? These institutions that, went up to 40% of corporate profits, what are they doing? They're mostly moving money around and making a lot of, making a ton of profit and getting bailed out when they crash. And they're also draining a lot of talent. Like you go to, say, MIT, where I teach in the math department now, and most math departments, there's a section in the graduate math department which is called financial mathematics. That's people getting their PhDs in mathematics so they can figure out ways of milking the taxpayer more, literally. There is no social utility to working out some complicated method by which Goldman Sachs can save a couple of seconds on its transactions and beat out the next guy. There's no social utility. It's draining talent away from productive activities. It's playing around games with money and getting away with it because you have the government insurance policy, and the deregulation means you can do what you like. So yeah, there would have been alternative approaches, even accepting some kind of, keep the institutions, turn them into socially useful ones. And there's a whole range of options between just letting them crash and, say, nationalizing everything. Same with the auto industry. I mean, when Obama essentially took over most of the auto industry, it was owned by you, actually, at that point. There were a number of things that could have been done. One was what actually was done. Keep selling off, dismantling plants, keep exporting jobs, try to fix them up after their incompetent management is thrown out, try to fix them up so that they can be handed back to the old owners pretty much and function more efficiently. That's what was done. There were other possibilities. For example, the country has vast needs. I mean, I don't know how many of you take trips to New York, say, but you go to New York, you go by the fanciest train in the country, the Acela, which my wife and I took 60 years ago. It's now, I think, 15 minutes faster than it was when we took it in 1950. In any other country in the world, practically, it would get there in half the time. Without knocking you all over the place so you can't read and so on and so forth. And that's just a scandal. We're like a third world country. Well, those are things that the skilled workers in the auto companies could have done something about. You could hand if banks don't want to fund it, fine, hand it over to the workforce, as almost happened in Taunton. Let them reconstruct it, maybe some federal funding, much less than was actually given, and let it be turned to socially useful production, like high-speed rail. Instead, what happened, and this is kind of surreal, at the same time that the government was continuing the policy of dismantling plants, and remember, dismantling a plant means destroying a community, not just the lives of the workers, but usually the whole community depends on the plants. So not only dismantling them, but also Obama's transportation secretary was off in Europe trying to get contracts from Spanish companies to build high-speed rail for us. That's a sign of the bankruptcy of social and economic planning, which is really dramatic. So yeah, there were things that could have been done and still can be done. Plenty of options, even without any significant social change.
So take it back to Egypt for a second. Do you find Al-Qaeda's silence to be unusual considering their ties with Egypt?
Whose silence?
Al-Qaeda? Do you find their silence to be unusual?
Al-Qaeda?
Yeah.
Well, actually, they're not. They're, according to the information available, they're somewhat rethinking their planning to ask how they can make use of the new situation to their benefit. First of all, Al-Qaeda, remember, is a bit of a fiction. I mean, there is, it exists, but it's what's called a leaderless network. There's some symbols like Osama bin Laden and maybe some plans come down. But mostly the actions attributed to Al-Qaeda are, if you trace them, they're due to independent cells all over the place, which share some kind of an ideology and maybe share some kind of allegiance to semi-mythical figures, but are carrying out actions on their own. That's almost entirely the case. There's plenty of research into this, as you can imagine. They're called a network of networks with a leaderless organization, pretty much. So yeah, they're probably rethinking their plans. I mean, after all, their major goal has been, the major target of the whole Al-Qaeda network was the dictatorships. They want to get rid of them. The main one, Saudi Arabia, their main enemy, main U.S. ally. The status of the dictatorships is very much in question now. It hasn't reached Saudi Arabia yet, but it might. So they're doubtless rethinking what they can do under these circumstances. And I think that's, I think you can read this in the newspapers, but I think it's correct this time. That's probably the reason for the temporary silence. What should they be announcing?
You mentioned the Hascom manufactured plant in time numerous times this evening.
Put the microphone a little farther.
You mentioned the plant in time that was closed numerous times this evening. That is just close to home. I live on the same block where that is. The local politicians they did absolutely nothing to encourage work solidarity and being able to purchase the equipment necessary. And it was said locally that this was because they had no vested interest in this factory. And yesterday I was listening to the Diane Rain show, and the speaker was speaking of Governor Walker in Wisconsin, and mentioned that he said that the governor needs to take his personal interest, his personal financial interests, and put them alongside the interests of the citizens of Wisconsin. Is that...
You're talking about Walker's personal interest?
Yes, with the Koch brothers and so forth. Is it possible for a democracy, for that to happen, for the governor's personal financial interests to be put alongside the interests of his citizenship, the people whom he governs, and for democracy to flourish?
It could, but that's peanuts. I mean, you mentioned the Koch brothers. That's more significant. I mean, I don't know whether Scott Walker has a big bank account or not, and if he does, it doesn't matter that much. It's not going to affect things. The issue is not the person, Scott Walker. It's the institutional structure in which he's operating. And the funding for it is coming from these huge right-wing funders like the Koch brothers. I mean, they're the ones who are prominent. And they're kind of in the lead of a campaign to try to dismantle what's left of American democracy, including unions and anything else. And, it's understandable from their point of view. Actually, outside my window at my office at MIT, I've got a stare at the Koch building that just went up next door. That's how they prettify their image, by funding a cancer center. But the main thing they're doing is, trying to, my guess, I don't know this, my suspicion is that they're kind of, puppet masters. They pretty much dominate the American Conservative Caucus and so on. My guess is they're probably trying to groom Walker for a presidential run. on a program which they suspect may be popular, may be able to bring popular support. It's a tricky business being what's called a conservative, meaning a right-wing extremist. It has nothing to do with conservatism in any old sense. You've got to, your policies have to be to enrich and empower a tiny sector of the population and harm everyone else. But at the same time, you have to gain popular support. That's a tricky operation. There are ways of doing it. So the Republicans in the last 20, 30 years have more or less stopped being a political party in the traditional sense. But they have gained popular support, for one reason, by mobilizing Christian evangelicals. And they've been there forever, but they were never organized into a political force until the Reagan years, really. And that gives you a pretty solid voting base. I mean, remember, this country is just off the spectrum in religious fundamentalism, totally off the spectrum, always has been since the colonists. But by now you have, at least the polls can be believed, about a third of the population believing that every word of the Bible is literally true. You have one of the new Republicans who's the head of some committee on the environment explained that you don't have to worry about global warming because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. I don't think there's any other country in the world where somebody could say that and not be laughed out of, the room. But that passes here. So you can mobilize, that's a pretty solid base of voting support. You throw them some raw meat every once in a while, abortion or whatever you don't care about. And the other, but I think a bigger one is this a new technique of blaming public sector workers for the financial crisis. You read the New York Times, let's say, when they give you reporting from Wisconsin. They select carefully people who are maybe union workers or working class or, the wife of a worker and so on, who they can get to say, honestly, I'm sure, look, I don't have a job. Why should I be paying the pension for these teachers who have jobs, and why should they be getting pensions when I don't even have a job? Well, yeah, if you can direct anger and frustration against vulnerable people, you can get somewhere. There's some pretty unpleasant models about that, like Adolf Hitler, for example. There was plenty of anger and frustration in Germany. And if you could divert it to Jews and Bolsheviks and gays and so on, yeah, you could get 90% of the population supporting you, which is what happened with consequences that weren't too pretty. So it's not some new idea, Reagan was a master at this. So those of you who are old enough to remember will remember the tales about the black mothers being driven in their chauffeured Cadillacs to the welfare station to pick up their welfare check and go home and spend it on, a fur coat or something. And that sold. In fact, you look at polls today, it's very interesting. By and large, the population is kind of social democratic. They want more spending on health and education and pretty progressive things. And they do want more spending on help for the poor, but not welfare. So they oppose welfare, but more spending on, mothers with dependent children, people who are out of luck or whatever it may be. In other words, welfare. But they're against welfare, and that's a triumph of Reaganite propaganda. Welfare means that rich black mother who's stealing your money. And I think that the Koch brothers or whoever does their thinking for them are probably planning a campaign with a guy like Walker as the front runner who'll run on that program. We got to take our country back and get it away from these school teachers who are ripping us off and so on. And this combines, the school teachers particularly, you can't go too far after the police and firefighters, maybe a little, but not too far. But the teachers, really, they do want to get rid of. Not that there won't be any teachers, but you won't have any public education. You're not going to privatize the police department yet, at least. But you can privatize public education. Maybe pretty soon they'll turn the police over to Blackwater, but it hasn't happened yet.
Thank you.
All right, if we could have a few more questions, we'll just try to be short so we can hear everybody.
I have two questions. The first one is, you're giving us a lot of information. Is there like any site that we can go to look at this?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Okay. And then my second question is, you've been comparing Governor Walker to former President Hosni Mubarak. Don't you think that that's a little bit of an extreme, because even though he's trying to take away collective bargaining, he's not taking away freedom of speech or declaring martial law, socializing all of the industries in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's right. Scott Walker is not Hosni Mubarak. Maybe he is personally, but the institutions in which the two of them exist are different. That's why I said the trajectories are meeting and crossing. In the United States, the trajectory is down. It's to taking away rights that have been won. In the case of Egypt, it's up. It's to gaining rights that were denied them. And at this point, we actually see them crossing. Incidentally, there are attacks on freedom of speech. And some of the worst ones are coming from the Obama administration. One of the, didn't get too much publicity, but there was a court case last year which is pretty ominous. It was initiated by the Obama administration. If you want to look it up, it's Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project. And if you sort of look at what was at stake, I think it's the worst attack on freedom of speech since the Smith Act in 1941. It essentially says that any material support, including speech, advice, for example, any material support to an organization on the terrorist list is a criminal. Now, first of all, the terrorist list itself is completely illegitimate, totally. I mean, the government just says you're on the terrorist list. There's no surveillance, no supervision, nothing. And so some of the things that happen are just comical. Like, for example, Reagan in 1982 wanted to support his friend Saddam Hussein and send him, support to help build up his army and so on. Well, Iraq was on the terrorist list, so they had to take him off. So they took Iraq off the terrorist list so the United States could then support Saddam Hussein through his worst atrocities, incidentally. Now, that's what the terrorist list is like. You shouldn't, it should not exist in a decent society. But now, under the Obama-initiated ruling, which passed the Supreme Court with the support of the right-wing justices, you can be penalized for, say, giving advice to an organization on that terrorist list. For example, advising them to turn to nonviolent means or to join the political process or something like that. That's pretty serious. And in fact, it's already being used. The FBI has raided apartments in Minneapolis and Chicago and given out subpoenas and are charging people with supporting one or another group that they don't like. So there are attacks on freedom of speech, but sure, it's not Egypt. Although we want to make sure we don't go there while they're going the other way.
What he was saying about support, if you suggest to these, like say you suggested to the Taliban to not use nonviolence, that's considered supporting the regime.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. We've spoken a lot tonight about the institutional negation of democracy in America and abroad. And it's long been an observation of mine that the debt-based fiduciary Federal Reserve System is one of the greatest barriers to enacting true democracy in the United States. In that context, I was curious what sort of monetary system you would advocate for.
Well, there's a lot of that kind of criticism of the Fed, and frankly, I think it's misguided. There's a lot wrong with the Fed. So, for example, take the housing crisis. This is $8 trillion. That's a little hard to miss. They missed it. Not only they, but practically all economists. It's not that they didn't notice it. They were enthralled to a religious doctrine called the efficient market hypothesis, which you study if you're in an economics course. And according to that hypothesis, it can't be a problem. That's about as realistic as this congressman saying, don't worry about global warming because God promised Noah there won't be a flood. I mean, there's no empirical basis for the efficient market hypothesis. It's accepted in the profession because it makes it easy to prove theorems and things like that. But there was no reason to believe it. But if you accept this religious doctrine, then if you see the housing prices shooting off into space after 100 years of tracking GDP, you don't notice it. And as late as 2007, Bernanke, the head of the Fed, was saying can't be a problem. And kind of like this congressman and Noah. Well, okay, that kind of criticism of the Fed makes sense. But a modern economy cannot function without a central bank. And essentially that's what the Fed is. So you can, all kind of things wrong with it, like maybe it shouldn't be owned by private banks, it should be public or something else. But some sort of a central financial institution is really essential in an economy anything like ours. You could imagine totally different economies, but we're not talking about that.
I was born in East Germany and still have a lot of family in Germany. Under that system, which mandated that the government be, after World War II, focus on the interest of the individual, it seems like the government of the United States more focused on the interests of the corporation. And it seems like in the political debates that go on, that the middle class and the poor, for example, that are supported in Germany by governmental actions are, in this country, totally unrepresented and totally duped. The discussions that go on seem to have nothing to do with the interests of that middle class or that poorer class. And so I'd like to ask, where do you see representation for those people coming in the future, if it's to come at all? I don't think it's coming. It doesn't look like it is, but if it's to come, where will that come from?
Well, I don't know if we should go into this, but I don't think we should look at East Germany as any kind of a model. There may have been some, theoretical ideology about working for the benefit of the people, but that's not what any of the Leninist governments have been doing since 1917.
No, I'm sorry. To clarify, I was thinking in terms of Germany today, West Germany in particular.
Yeah, West Germany has a kind of social market economy, like most of the industrial world. So, for example, in Germany, there's a health system that works, there's an educational system that works, there's technically co-determination in industry. It doesn't mean that much, but it means there's 50% union representation on management boards. It's a softer system. It's a softer state capitalist system than ours. And there's more, it also has a parliamentary system, so you can have small parties running and things like that. And there are a lot of advantages to it. On the other hand, there are a lot of things wrong. Like Germany now, all of Germany, but West Germany is committed to a very conservative central bank policy, which imposes austerity. They dominate the European Bank, which is pursuing austerity policies which are pretty harmful for the economy. They ought to be, here Obama I think is right, they should be stimulating, not reducing government spending. And this is what traces back to the German kind of paranoia about inflation, which was a real problem in the 1920s. But it has nothing to do with what's happening now. So there's downsides, plenty of them. Also, in many ways, the United States is a much more free country. I mean, take what I started off by saying about the 14th Amendment and compare it with Germany. The United States is, unusual, maybe unique. I think the United States was the first country, I'm pretty sure, to grant a citizenship by birth. The 14th Amendment says if you're born in this country, you're a citizen. In Germany, if you want to get citizenship, you've got to show that you're ethnically, racially German. Like you had enough blue-eyed and blonde-haired ancestors. It's been slightly modified, but that's been the way for a long time, and that's the way most countries are. There is an effort here by the far right to take away that progressive element in the 14th Amendment, but it's still there. In Germany, it's been worse all along. That's why you get Angela Merkel, making that speech about multiculturalism, how it's failing, because the Turks, who are doing the dirty work in German society, somehow can't figure out how to get blue eyes and blonde hair and become authentic Germans. So they're kind of an extraneous feature in the society. So there's good and bad. I don't want to say it's utopia, but it's true that the social market economy is more protective of the population and more democratic in that sense. However, you can't, if you look at American history, there have been ups and downs. There have been periods when, pretty much like this one. So you go back to the 1920s, say, the labor movement was totally destroyed, just not functioning at all. It was mostly destroyed by liberal Democrats, by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. And it was tremendous inequality, pretty much like now, wild financial speculation. Well, the country came out of it. In the 1930s, there was a significant revival of the labor movement, progressive legislation, which was sort of forced on a rather willing government, but forced on it by mostly militant labor activism. And you got, you ended up with a situation like I described, this golden age, rapid growth, egalitarian growth, progressive legislation, not utopia, but progress. And it can happen again. The last 30 years have been a period of regression, but it's not the first period like that. The Gilded Age in the late 19th century was another. And there have been popular struggles which revived a more free and democratic society. And in fact, even during this period, the last 30 years, say, this period of regression on social and economic policy, there's been plenty of progress. And we shouldn't overlook that. And the progress didn't come by magic. It came by activism. It's a much more civilized country than it was 40 years ago in a lot of dimensions. Women's rights, environmental concerns, global justice concerns. None of this stuff, all this stuff is extremely weak in the 1960s. It developed in the wake of 60s activism, and it changed the country a lot, for the better, in fact. So things aren't that simple. There's plenty of opportunities here to recover what we had and to go forward.